Hi, this is Simon Upstall and welcome to this fourth part of my compositing series in which we're looking at a range of professional green screen keying techniques and how we can execute them in Apple Motion. So let's get going. So in this part we'll be looking at two finishing touches that will really elevate your composite to the professional level. So I'm going to be looking at light wrap and I'm going to be looking at edge blend. And it probably makes sense to look at edge blend first of all. Now I'm just going to zoom into this area here, and you can probably sense, even if you don't know necessarily, that there's something not quite right with this edge. So we've got a nice soft edge, we've got a nice blue spill on it, but somehow it doesn't really feel as though the foreground and the background belong. And if we just create a very, very soft blend along the edge between the foreground and the background, we can actually improve on that. So let's look at how we're going to do that. So again, we're going to use our mat. So the mat really drives pretty much every single one of these operations. And that's why it's important to kind of get it pretty good before you even start doing any fancy stuff. So again, we're going to make a clone of the mat. So the first thing I want to do with this clone is I want to come to Stylize and Min-Max. Now, this is a typical Apple filter that is called something completely different from what everybody else calls it. In the real world, this is called the Erode Dilate filter because it expands the white areas and contracts the black areas, or the light and the dark, I should say. In this case, it's white and black. So if we, first of all, switch this to maximum, and I'm going to set this radius to 1 pixel, and you're not really going to see anything, but then I'm going to duplicate this clone, right-click, duplicate. I'm going to come over to filters. I'm going to switch to minimum, and then I'm going to come to its blend mode and choose subtract. And now you can see we've got this very nice, very, very fine edge mat that we can use to create our edge blend. So let's rename that as edge mat. We don't need to see it. We can turn that off. So as I say, the edge blend is a blend of the foreground and the background. So what we're actually going to have to do is come to Object New Group, and we're going to drop the foreground and the background into there. And let's just call this composite. Probably not quite the right name, but anyway, let's close that down and let's clone it. So right click and make clone layer. And to this clone, we're going to add an image mask, and we're going to select our edge matte, and we're going to switch to luminance. I'm just going to temporarily turn off the composite so we can see what we've got. So now our edge matte is filled with both the foreground and the background. And we need to do a little bit of blurring of it so we get a smear between those two. So let's add a Gaussian blur, and maybe an amount of 16 is probably enough. So let's call this edge blend, and let's turn back on our composite group, the background there. So now if we zoom in here, you can see the effect of our edge blend layer. We've got this much softer blend between the foreground and the background. And we can even just come into the opacity and dial that back probably to around 50-60%, and it's going to look smoother still. And it's a very small detail, but it is taking care of some of that sharpness of this edge. Bear in mind our foreground is pretty soft anyway, so you'd expect that to be soft. But in the real world, in a photographic world, you would always get some kind of blurring between the foreground and the background pixels. So that's edge blend. So now let's look at light wrap, which uses a fairly similar principle. Remember when we were talking about the spill operation? So the thing about spill, as we discovered, is that the environment wraps itself around the foreground. It's the nature of light that it does this kind of wrapping effect. And what we did when we de-spilled, we tried to take care of the fact that our green environment was wrapping itself around the edges of our foreground. And we did a pretty good job with our de-spill operation. But we can also enhance that by actually wrapping our background image around the edges. So that's what we're going to do here. So in this case, we're going to dive into this background group here, and we are going to select the futuristic city layer, and we are going to make a clone of it, and we are going to drag it out to the top. And then we're going to add an image mask again. And we're going to use, again, our matte, and we're going to switch to luminance. So what we want to do here is we want to invert the matte. Let's actually just turn everything off apart from this so we can see exactly what we're doing. So now we've inverted this matte, and we're going to blur it. So let's add a Gaussian blur. Let's have an amount of, say, 100 just to get us started. And then I'm going to duplicate this mask. So right-click, duplicate. And this time around, I'm going to subtract it. So set the mask blend mode to subtract. And now we have got this, but I need to delete that Gaussian blur copy. So you may now be able to see that we've got the background on the inside edge of our foreground. And what we also need to do is to give it a little bit of a blur. So select the clone layer, filters and blur and Gaussian blur, because obviously we don't want to see the background itself. We want to see the light component of the background, which is not going to have any detail in it. So we need to advance this blur until those details of the background are disappearing. In this case, around 100 is probably going to be fine. So let's call this group light wrap. Let's turn on edge blend and the composite group. And so for this light wrap, currently we're set to normal and it's sort of working, but generally speaking, it's better if we set the blend mode to screen. So I'm going to zoom into here so we can see exactly what we're doing. So it's kind of most obvious, obviously, on the hair, isn't it? So if I just reduce that opacity down to nothing, that's what we started with. And then if we just increase that value a little bit, we light wrap, just never go too far with it, just enough to make it feel that it's satisfying to you. 50% is probably as far as you want to go. And that actually looks fairly good. And of course, you can experiment with different blend modes, but generally speaking, screen is a good option. I just also want to point out that you can affect the depth of the light wrap by coming into this image mask here, the one with the Gaussian blur on it. And the more we increase this blur value, the more the light wraps around. Really, again, don't want to go too far, but as you can see, that makes the edge deeper. So I think we were probably pretty good with our initial guess of 100. But anyway, I just wanted to show you that as well. So there you go. Those are two finishing touches which are well worth trying that will elevate your key to the professional level. So I hope that's been interesting. There will be a part 5. Various other techniques I haven't even yet shown you, and I will be going into some theory in that final part. So thanks very much indeed for watching. I'll see you again soon.